Thanks for clicking. Welcome to one of our 9CI laboratories.
Laboratories.
Yeah.
It's one of the tech labs for
Tech
us.
lab.
Yeah.
We wanted to discuss some of the FCC changes that are upcoming.
Yes.
We have with us an older version of the draft, but we will do a more in-depth video once the full new draft is released. And we can get our hands on one of those. So among these changes are...
Well, there's a few things we can touch on.
Yeah.
When it was first brought to our attention, the concern was the talk about increased exposure levels possible, and I heard talk about depending on the frequency, the current limitations up to 10 million microwatts per square meter going higher. And so what we want to do, I think, today is just touch on what's happening and do a more detailed video when this information actually comes out.
Yeah, so we can have something to discuss tangibly.
Right. So the first part of it is basically just going over why they're doing this, and they're answering some questions. The premise for this is to help ease the burden to allow the rollout of more wireless infrastructure, and people will be going, oh, okay, great, okay, so they're making it easier. Yeah, they want to make it easier for people. So they go into great detail. Almost half this document is the FCC explaining why they're doing certain things and the questions that were posed to them and why they're agreeing or disagreeing with certain things. So the thing that happens multiple times in this document is many times there are statements such as, while research on the health effects of RF energy continues, no evidence has moved our sister health and safety agencies to issue substantive policy recommendations for strengthening RF exposure regulations. Indeed, the FDA maintains that the weight of scientific evidence has not linked cell phones with any health problems.
It's a very stark statement too. Like, this is what it is. And you're like, well, that's not what it is. We have evidence that suggests otherwise.
Exactly. They do acknowledge that over 1,000 comments or presentations were filed in this proceeding. The vast majority of filings were unscientific, and even the filings that sought to present scientific evidence failed to make a persuasive case for revisiting our existing RF limits. So
when were they taking these cases, by the way? When was this made available?
So this is the other thing. This document, I wish more people would know when this kind of document is up for
review and revision, and where you can post your comments. It's like closed doors policy changes. That it feels very like cloak and dagger.
It seems like it. It's like, unless you're in the know or tightly associated with in the communication
and getting emails,
you're not going to know about this. I found this document, or was directed to this document a few months after the submissions were closed. I think, right? So anyway, this is just sort of like driving while looking in the rearview mirror, so to speak. So that statement failed to make persuasive case for revisiting our. I just wonder, for example, the bioinitiative report. How many hundreds of papers, or a collection of all these papers. Here's another one. In other words, while the record includes scientific papers of variable quality and significance that allude to more restrictive RF exposure limits under certain circumstances, they fail to provide any specific pragmatic recommendation for how RF exposure limits could be adjusted as a result of this research.
So they have to figure out, one, that it's hurting you, and two, suggest a new power level.
Right. So
that's a long-term study, and that's a lot of study. It's very expensive.
It is. So let's put ourselves, let's say, for example, in the FCC's position. They do actually refer to the bioinitiative report and the building biology standards. And from the FCC's point of view, they are the Federal Communications Commission. So they're regulating how wireless devices, back in the early days of the FCC, how radios were regulated, transmitters, to be able to send and receive information, radio stations, but also for telephones, for mobile phones, but before that, radios, like, vintage two-way radios and stuff, and lives depended on radio communications, right? So from their perspective, what they're seeing, let's say from the building biology perspective, is that the building biologists are saying you need to have extremely low limits, so 0.3 to 0.6 nanowatts per square meter. The FCC is saying, acknowledging that these limits are millions to billion times more restrictive than the current FCC. But they say no device could reliably transmit any usable level of energy by today's technological standards while meeting these limits. So, true. Yeah. Let me get back to that. True. Further, this is what's unsettling to me. Further, there is no scientific evidence in the record that such restrictive limits would produce any tangible benefit to human health.
Which record, by the way?
Yeah, exactly.
Which record?
Or provide any improvement over current protections against established risks. Moreover, as noted by the FDA, there is no evidence to support that adverse health effects in humans are caused by exposures at, under, or even in some cases above the current RF limits. Indeed, no scientific evidence establishes a causal link between wireless device use and cancer or other illnesses. So, I wanted to get back to that. I do agree with the FCC that if you're going to say that we don't want to see anything over this 0.3 to 0.6 nanowatts per square meter, of course the FCC, putting yourself in there,
just going to scoff.
They're going to scoff at that.
It's kind of an extreme jump. You can't just, it's like raising the minimum wage. You can't do it overnight by $15. You have to. Exactly.
So there's two things to that. Okay, so yes, that is unrealistic. That's what's, unfortunately, that's what's eroding the credibility of electrosensitive people, because if they're saying that, look, we're not going to accept anything unless the levels are down that low, then they're basically saying we won't accept
they're
cell
not
phone.
Negotiating. They're not willing to negotiate at all.
It's black and white, and it's just like, well, you know what? The reality is that there's in between. So what, if anybody is listening to this or watching this that is an electrosensitive person, that is involved in organizations that are looking for change, you need to, or we need to, I should say, in addition to suggesting a compromise in power levels, say why, and provide alternatives relevant to today's technology that can enable those lower power levels to happen. So in the case of, let's say, 10 million microwatts per square meter, let's say we can lower it by 10 times.
Yeah. And it would still be very functional.
Yes.
And there's not really any proper testing to say like if certain power levels actually have a benefit or not. But if it still functions, why not?
Well,
for telecommunication versus health risks, we can reassess.
So basically, absolutely.
If they're going to be pushing these technologies already without testing properly, then we can reduce the power levels without testing properly and figure out as we go. Why not?
Good point. That's true. The other thing is 10 times the power level. So that's 10 dB signal to noise ratio difference. I tell you, companies like Qualcomm that are responsible for most of the communication chips in cell phones, we certainly, in most cases nowadays, have more than enough to drop the signal to noise ratio by 10 dB.
Yeah, just based on our technology.
Based on our technology improvements in the last 5 years, receivers are so much more sensitive. So this is just an example, sort of like, okay, why are you saying 10 million microwatts per square meter? Why are you saying that? Okay, well, they don't say that. They say 1 milliwatt per square centimeter, which is 10 million microwatts per square. We're used to smaller units, so forgive us
universal
for that.
Language would be better, but
universal language, but we don't want to talk in decimal points. So let's say it's 1 million microwatts per square, 0.1 milliwatts, or 0.1
milliwatts,
milliwatts per square centimeter. that's only 10 times lower. We can do that. And if enough people push to that, the telecom companies can do that, right? They can drop the transmitter powers at the cell phone sites by 10 times, and excuse me, and I think we'd be fine. So this is the kind of thing that this document, before reading this document, I really wasn't aware of the disconnect that is existing between these organizations and the FCC.
There's clearly some severe miscommunication going on.
They're
not, whoever they're opening up the table to, it hasn't been the right people, I'm guessing.
Right, exactly. And a lot of people that are electrosensitive don't have the background in electronics or engineering. Now, I tell you, I mean, case in point, with David, our David in 9CI, it's, there are a growing number of electrical engineers which are going, maybe we should revisit these things.
Yeah.
And I tell you, it's more realistic and it's easier to present a case when you're just talking about let's drop transmitter powers 10 dB. An engineer can be like, you know what? Yeah,
we could do that.
We could do that with signal to noise ratio. So that's the first part of it. We're going to talk about this more in detail, but essentially the document, the changes that are coming are threefold. There's 3 parts to it.
Yeah.
So the 1 milliwatt blanket exemption, I think that's going to come. Basically, they're saying that if the transmitter power is 1 milliwatt or lower, that basically they don't care about any of that stuff. And it can be anywhere close to the body, whatever. Okay.
Sorry, I realized some of the later points, so it's just like, oh yes, we're going to discuss that.
Right. So, for example, for the 1 milliwatt exemption, the medical implant community largely supports the rule. Okay, getting onto this. Motorola wanted that exemption to be 1.6 milliwatts, but the FCC declined because that would exceed the current SAR specific absorption rate limit. So that made me think, it's just sort of like, okay, so 1.6 is not cool, but 1 is. And you've got a 1 milliwatt transmitter that's going to be, let's say, subcutaneous or inside your head or something like that.
In your chest.
In your chest, whatever, exactly.
Or the new diabetic
the glucose monitors and things. These transmitters are going to be inside you transmitting. We don't know the duty cycle or how often they'll be transmitting. But so it's interesting because it's like, okay, so that shows, and a point that I was saying to Kayla before, 1 milliwatt doesn't sound like a lot of RF transmitter power, but when it's really close to you,
or inside,
then inverse square law distance, that can be another video maybe about that. It's not cool. So anyway, that's that part. There is the SAR-based exemption. So as in the case with cell phones, if you cannot accurately calculate power densities at certain distances, as is the case with prosumer electronics that are held very close to you, that's why SAR was invented, the specific absorption rate. So they got formulas for that. But for the most part, they're pushing people to use the power densities and maximum permissible exposure, MPE it's called. And so there are going to be, again, we're not going to go into details because these equations could change, but there are going to be new ways to calculate these things. And I dropped my sheet of paper, but basically this document, subject to final approval and publication, is that I think, if I remember correctly, everything above 1500 megahertz is still going to be 10 million microwatts per square meter. And then there are different formulas for between 300 megahertz and 1500 megahertz, 30 megahertz to 300 megahertz. And
it was like, was it 400,000 for the next one?
Right, yeah. So there's a formula between 300 megahertz and 1500 megahertz. The lower you go in frequency, the exposure standards are going to go down. What their reasoning for that is, I can speculate, is that longer wavelengths are more likely to penetrate into the body.
Or penetrate deeper
into the body for that. But
the final change is that they're not including children.
Oh, thank you for reminding me.
That's what I was going to be like, oh wait, we'll discuss it later.
Yeah, they specifically say this here, right here. We further decline to revisit our RF exposure policy as it pertains to children.
With children using more and more technology.
Right, exactly, and all the research that has shown how much more vulnerable, the skull thickness and things
thinner,
like that.
and their smaller bodies, so it penetrates farther, because it's like, on an adult it would only hit the left hemisphere, but on a child it's like, oh, it's all the way over to the right. Well,
right. So as Kayla mentioned before, let's assume the power density maximums don't change. The question still falls back to how they arrive at these and how they continue to dismiss research. So it's going to be interesting, but it's worth discussion. Comments, any feedback on this? But I'm glad to have read this document because, as I said, I didn't fully understand why there's this disconnect between these two worlds.
And we knew that there would be changes coming. We just didn't realize it was going to be in the exact opposite direction that we were expecting / hoping and trying to substantiate our, we think, very valid reasons for decreasing the power levels.
Right.
Or changing the SAR, the standard measurement.
Right.
And
yeah, exactly. So
at least maybe basing SAR on children, like, rather than a 200-pound man.
Exactly, right. The SAR-based standard right now is based on a 200-pound American male, somebody that was Army personnel, basically. So yeah, children are not that physical size.
No.
So to be continued. I do look forward to doing a more comprehensive video when we get the final paper.
Yeah.
Let's do that. But in the meantime, this is just something to digest until that report comes out.
If anyone happens to know where these meetings are happening or when,
right,
maybe we could spread that information.
Yeah, actually, if we get on the mailing list or something like that.
Yeah, someone gets on the mailing list, please let us know.
The mailing
We'd love
list,
to discuss.
We can make a YouTube video and be like, okay, in the future, now for the next 6 months, if you've got things to say, here's some ideas on how to word it, and so
we can grow the community and perhaps make more comprehensive arguments that the FCC will actually be willing to listen to.
Exactly. Right now, I guess the analogy would be somebody going into a courtroom that has no legal experience whatsoever. And the court system is used to dealing with certain protocols, and the FCC
terminology.
FCC is used to dealing with certain protocols. But I think actually we are one organization. 9CI is an ideal organization to make some cases, because not only are some of us extremely electrosensitive, but we work in the industry. RF is something I do almost on a daily basis, and I figured out a way to make it work. So other people can do that too.
Exactly. So thanks for sticking with us. Please feel free to leave some comments below. Don't forget to subscribe. You can follow us on Bitchute and LBRY as well. And stay safe out there.